everyone, and welcome to our streamed readings tonight. It's Literary Nights with Unsolicited Press. Thank you all for joining us and hearing the fantastic writers and authors that we have with us this evening. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone to smash the like button and to subscribe so that you can hear all of our shows. They occur every 2 weeks on a Wednesday. So tonight we're welcoming Elisa Carlson, Mari Matthias, and Summer Schaefer. We have two fiction writers with us tonight and a poet. As usual, we go in alphabetical order. So, Elisa, we're going to start with you, and if you could sort of tell us a little bit about your book, and we'll look forward to hearing you read.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. This is my book from Unsolicited Press. It's called Cormorant. And this is the culmination of about 4 years of my life's work with the Army Corps of Engineers. I worked on a plan that was under the umbrella of salmon recovery in the Columbia River Basin, and a plan to actually cull a large number of cormorants to support salmon recovery. And it was highly controversial. And I met a woman who was the founder of a wildlife center, rehabilitation center, and her life and her work and her death inspired this collection. I wanted to just read a few poems. They're very short poems. This is a pretty short collection, about 25 poems, and a dedication piece to Charnel that explains kind of the full story. But I'll start reading a poem called Threatened and Endangered. The federal government was built to be impervious to apology. As they weigh the extinction of species against the economy of change, their money is always on their money. They are heartless like the Tin Man, but worse because they don't want a heart. A heart is weak and leads to love, and love would fracture the story they've told of their perfect past in passive mood. Love would make them see how they are as bound by the suffering they set in stone to break the river's back as I am to a bullet in the gun aimed at a bird in flight. So another poem along a similar theme about the impact of the dams on the Columbia River, the federal dams on the Columbia River. This is called Migration. It is not so much a river anymore, it is machine forged now. A mass of dammed steel and rubble, slowed down the whole way by a need that will never go until we go. In government speak, it is called Federal Columbia River Power System or Columbia River System Operations, depending on the lawsuit and who is in charge of public affairs. Translated, it means a bunch of dams, run of river or high head, built with rebar, broken treaties, and big rocks to keep air entrained in water. Home to wild fish, just barely. I'll read, and the titles of my poems all come from key phrases or references to the Cormorant Wildlife Management Plan that I worked on. So I'm trying to kind of address these kind of professional experiences through this poetry. And this poem kind of describes my state of being while I was working on this project. This is called Fledgling. All my life, I've tried to slip the knot, tied to the bow of my body from birth. Wanted to lift my life up and conform the shape of me to something the world could love. Instead, I entered every room, awkward and unordained, stuck in that space between space where lost things live, who only want to feel the promise of their life again, like a pursuit diver on a broken piling near the mix of salt and cold dark water, who dives to break a transverse wave down to unfathomable depths in the singular purpose of their skill and the orbit of their own time. I'll read another couple of poems about my experience really working with the people in the Army Corps. The first one here is called Banded. And these are all things that were said to me by my fellow employee, my fellow coworkers. Banded. I'm paraphrasing here, but something is wrong with me. I suck at email. I seem angry all the time. I started talking back, asking stupid questions. I'm a crazy dyke bitch. I should do myself a favor and not talk. I don't understand the basic concepts. I'm incorrigible and incapable of checking a simple box. I took everything they said about me and I put my name on it. And I sewed it to my skin and wore it everywhere I went, like I deserved it. So, I mean, you kind of gather the Army Corps was a challenging place to work. And this poem here is kind of me just like being really frustrated. This is called Peer Review. If my people were here, they'd say, fuck this. Let's go where eagles dare. And we would, and they'd take me home to breathe the warm, dry, dreamy air. But I am peerless here, perched 10 stories above Portland on a pink plastic chair in a late night meeting with my boss, a Queen Cruella, and a 3-star in the corner. And we're talking about killing fish, eating birds for eating fish, as if it made all the sense in the world. So much of this project was just, I guess, what I would call a political theater, where the government gets an idea and rarely the government gives up on that idea. And so the idea came to manage these birds for benefit of salmon. And despite prevailing evidence to suggest that that would have no benefit to salmon, the government went forward and did this thing. And one of the results of that was the founder of the Wildlife Center of the North Coast was very heartbroken of that. And she actually passed away a few months after the birds started getting shot. And many of her friends attribute that this project, the Cormorant Project, as the cause of her death. And so I carried a lot of shame and grief for her when I wrote these poems. And I'll read a few poems that are very specific to her. And one is called Scientific Integrity. There is no doubt you went between the folds of interstitial space, indeterministic beat. I bet you measure the many moods of waterbirds behind a perfect blind with your still empirical heart. And even though it's been years since your last sighting, there are echoes of you here, a lasting long-winded coo roosting in the snags of second growth Sitka, from the sandy yellow shore where a cormorant, double-crested, dives in the air, and where someone who has loved something sacred gives it back to its wild, like you were given to yours. And I think, how am I doing on time?
Can't hear you, Rosalia.
You're fine. This streamed reading lasts for an hour.
Okay.
So we could just cut into the Q&A, but very powerful poetry. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll read a few more for her then. Is that okay? Okay. This is called Social Attraction. This is dedicated to Charnel. I wonder about you, my maybe friend, with your tin heart, a wolf trap for misfits and their kin. You love wild things so much, the fingers on your hand blur into a web and look like pelican feet standing one-legged on driftwood. Your bright brown sea lion eyes shining, ever watching that great blue bear, the ocean. Your raspy voice sounding like a DOS printer running out of time until it did. If I could wish you back with my dark birdie poems just for the few sunny days we get here, I would. So I'll read 2 more poems. This poem is called Nest Initiation, and this is also just about, it's kind of for Charnel, but it's also just kind of for, like the soul of me that I lost in that experience. Nest Initiation. Every beginning is a particle of light exploding into the sun, expanding uniformly until we appear to shoulder the wonder of it all. Carve our story from time and make count the exact number of days we have to be here. Because when they pass, we'll call back to them, heads full of nostalgia for the dive bars and hullabaloo crowds, for our weird and hungry hearts still longing to be filled, like a river waiting for rain, like I was waiting for you. And I'll end this reading with a poem called Interstitial Space. This is actually the first poem in my collection. And interstitial space, for people who might not be familiar with that term, essentially means the space between space. And so much of, I think, what I'm moved by are things that aren't seen. Interstitial space. You were always more bird than body of Christ, ranging far above the blue-gray pulse of water, above the emerald fields of your favorite river valley, most alive on foggy mornings, where the only light of day comes late but fits the mood like mystic, and where you left us for the salted waves and secret lives of gulls. I came here only because I hoped to find something of myself or other missing things. But I had no point of bearing to that true west, and I got lost along its hallowed edge. And to live, I had to learn to take my rain like medicine, until it blended with my blood and thinned me out so I could float, past our storied river's bar, where the shipwrecks and seiners lost their songs to the sea, past the shoals and coastal cliffs, to all the water in the world. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your powerful poetry with us, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A when we can discuss it. So Mari is a fiction writer, so could you tell us a little bit about your book and also what you'll be reading?
Yeah, this is my novel. It came out at the end of 2022, so it's about 2 years old now. It's called the Runestone's Promise. My name's Mari Matthias. It's my first novel. And I have a second novel that's coming out in about a year and a little bit. So I'm going to read from the published one. This is a story about, it's a historical novel. It tells a story of a young woman who is confronted with questions about her mother in particular. And strange things happen, and it makes her start to ask questions. I'm not going to start at the beginning. The beginning, we have Gertine, our protagonist, and her husband comes home, and he brings the news that the wedding of her sister, who is in 2 days, has been called off by her mother, and so she's confused by that. And this is the next morning. Gertine could see her mother's big house with its steep pitched roof, the old brown barn, the long hay field all under snow. It still felt like home to her. I should say this is in Norway. 1799, Norway. It still felt like home to her, though life had changed mightily in the past year. Her gelding, Midler, a creamy fjord horse, stepped smartly on short legs down the dirty road that cut through the whiteness, packed and rutted from passing sleigh runners and other riders. To the road's north was the river. It had been wide across to abrupt snowy hills, but here the river narrowed, the yonder hills even more sheer, so that walls of bare earth showed. Evergreen trees nestled at hills' feet and hid in nooks. On top, a few spindly deciduous trees stood resigned to their nakedness. The southern side of the road was trimmed by a long rock hedge, thickly frosted with snow, snaking past the many family farms with undulating fields and clusters of little storefronts set along this ancient trade route. Gertine yawned, lulled by the sway and rhythm of Midler's stride. The hour to rise had come early, much too early after Gertine's long, fretful night. It was still dark in the late winter of this country, so near the coldest northlands. The days were painfully short. Ove was out of bed first, a farmer's duties calling loudly. Gertine had lain curled under the heavy blankets, hiding from the world. But the day couldn't be denied for long. It was curiosity and concern that had propelled her up and into the cold darkness. She was to spend the night with her sister Karin, this eve of the wedding. At least that had been the plan. Now she didn't know what to think, so she was coming anyway. She shivered despite the warmth of the beast she rode, the thick coat she wore over her long wool dress, and the knitted scarf wrapped snugly round her head. The 3-hour ride gave her time to ponder her sister's situation and her mother's reasons, and yet she found herself thinking mostly of her father. There was little she knew. Eric Anker had once been a pastor, and although that was before he and her mother were married, Mette had proudly claimed the title of Madam, which was always bestowed upon pastors' wives and widows. Madame Anker never spoke of her lost husband, not that Gertine could remember. She imagined he looked much like her brother John, handsomely chiseled, slight hook to the nose, only older and distinguished, perhaps with gray peppering a ginger beard. She could see in her mind eyes, her daddy's kind eyes, blue like her own, certainly eyes that smiled and reassured. She imagined him a patient, all-knowing sage full of just the right thing to say and do. She knew growing up without a father was only part of her story. It was an identity, just as each traveler had a short explanation for themselves. Merchant in search of trade partners or peddling his wares, grandparents traveling to visit young ones, young man seeking the mountainous country, fatherless daughter of the inn matron. Not until she'd met Ove and then his family did she realize that she had always felt a loss. She didn't even know what was missing, merely that she had grown up with an emptiness in a small but important way. Other than the smoke curling from the chimney, the place was as still as a drawing. It was dark yet, though barely, and unearthly quiet, as if even the air was holding her breath. But Gertine knew her mother would have long since been up to milk the goats and gather eggs before preparing and serving the breakfast meal for the guests. It was now halfway to the midday dinner, and few were likely to be leaving the inn today, as most staying in it had come for the wedding. Gertine wondered if they knew the wedding was not to happen. She suddenly felt silly. It must all be a mistake. Thank you. So my forthcoming book, which again, it's called Clea's Bequest, but it's not set to be published until April of 2026. So it's in the queue, but it's got a ways before it'll be born. It's very different from the published book. It's contemporary, and it's set in the Pacific Northwest. So I wanted to read just a little bit of that, and I'm hopping into the middle. This story is again about family discord. There's an estranged family, 3 adult siblings, and their mother has just died, and they find that they are that she has put into her will a lot of just nitpicky requirements in order for them to inherit. And one thing you need to know is that one of the requirements is to share custody of her urn over the coming year. And another requirement is to write letters to the deceased mother, to be read to the urn by the current guardian of the urn on specific days. So this is a scene where the oldest daughter, it's kind of going a little insane, and she's she still doesn't have one of the letters from one of her siblings, and she's getting a little stressed about that. The wine swirled, murky and foreboding, as Elise poured it into a tumbler big enough to hold almost half a bottle. Some drips fell onto the counter, like drops of errant blood. Just a little left, she gulped the rest straight from the bottle and set it empty onto the counter, next to the other empty, before upending the porcelain urn into her biggest mixing bowl. Fine dry powder tumbled down, careful, until the bulk of it dropped into the bowl with a muted thud. She coughed a little as airborne cinder caught in her throat. You mom dust. A little bit poured wide and ended up dusting the counter. Oops, there's a finger, an earlobe. Won't miss that though, will you, Mom? She remembered the big pearls her mother always wore. Did she take them off to sleep? Were they now reduced to ash, mixed with her mother's remains? Elise felt suddenly lightheaded, hyperventilating. Was she dehydrated? Not enough rest lately? She snorted a laugh, choked out like a sob. I really am going insane. But am I insane if I know I'm insane? It was late, really late. The kids in bed. Jeff was at an important function at the lodge. Who knew when he'd be home? He'd left just before dinner with a vexed door slam. They couldn't seem to say a civil word to each other lately. Well, she couldn't seem to say a civil word to him. Elise took another long swallow of Cabernet and set the glass down, checked her phone. Nothing. Important function, she jeered, making air quotes, and laughed again. They were leaving for Phoenix in the morning, and she still hadn't gotten that damn mother letter from Kevin. Fucking Kevin! She needed that inheritance money. If Jeff was cheating and her marriage was over, well, she couldn't support herself on a substitute teacher wage. No benefits, no pay in summer, no security whatsoever. Elise pulled her hair into a short ponytail using her hairband on her wrist, and she rolled up her sleeves. Shit, can't fool me, she mumbled as she drove her fingers into her mother's ashes, combing through, searching. Little plumes wafted up, tickling her nose. She paused, suddenly quite aware that she was digging through her mother's remains. But she didn't trust her mother. She was convinced there'd be something in the urn, a knife, a pistol, something that would show up on the x-ray machine at airport security, and she'd end up in jail, and her mother will have shown her who's boss once again. Important function! She wasn't going to take any chances. What was left of her mother was soft and quiet. Elise listened to the house as she stared at her ash-coated fingers, trying to hear her mom walking around. She hadn't figured out how to talk with Caleb yet, her son. He was having a hard time with this. Since their little chat, Daphne did nothing but glare at her for her inaction. Do you see what you're doing to us, Mother? She hissed at the ceramic vase. Get out of my house. I should dump you in the backyard. She pawed through, continuing to feel around, needing to be thorough, and getting mesmerized by the sifting feel of the powder. She gasped as she bumped into something solid, roundish, a pearl. With thumb and forefinger, she carefully plucked it from the bowl, blew away dust, and examined it. Her wine-slurred brain slowly realized it was not a pearl, but a molar. Revulsed, she let go. The tooth landed silently, making a tiny crater in the charred remains. Oh my God, what is wrong with me? Her phone pinged beside her elbow, drawing her attention. A notification appeared, showing Kevin's text. I emailed the letter. Elise stared at it, the long-awaited text disappearing as the screen went black. She shook ash from her hands, wiping them on her leggings before seizing her phone and looking for that email. Yes, finally! His mother letter was brief, but it was there. Good old Kevin. Elise stretched out her arms, palms flat on the counter as though bracing herself. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs. She surveyed the mess she had made. Salvageable. She wouldn't let her mother beat her. Ha! She washed her hands in the sink and found a funnel, which she used to pour her mother back into her porcelain cage. She secured the lid. The ash in the air settled as she picked up her wine glass and toasted the urn. Bring it on, damn you. Thank you. Oh, Rosalia, your mute button.
Oh. Can you hear me now? What an amazing scene. I don't think I'll ever forget that scene. And now we're to our final reader, Summer Schaefer, also a fiction writer. And Summer, we're very anxious to hear what you're going to read for us tonight. Tell us about your book.
Hi, everyone. This is such a pleasure spending an hour reading literature. I mean, this is amazing. I bought your book, Elisa. Yeah, and haven't finished it, but love the premise behind it. And Mari, I'm going to get yours. It sounds, especially the one coming 2026. That sounds riveting. I'm going to read from my collection of short stories. Sorry, I'm blurred out. There, The Women.
The Women.
Yeah, it came out November 3, and it's my first book, so it's been quite an interesting year to kind of go through the whole thing. And it's a collection of 17 short stories about 17 different women. And I've heard people tell me there's a bit of sci-fi in it. There's a bit of fantasy. There's a bit of body horror. I have just about everything in here, I guess. I don't know. The stories just almost write themselves, right? You get an idea and it just comes out no matter how. So I chose one of the shorter stories. And this, I guess, is more of a realistic story, not really so much of the fantasy and the sci-fi and some of the body horror that the other stories have. This is called The Bison. Don't get so close, Jim. Mother's voice was taut with worry and swung up into a feverish, drawn-out tone, so that close seemed to signify you will die. The four of us had basically gotten used to Mother's reactions, maybe read some protective love in it, and Father just plain ignored her. The summer of '81, Father had decided a trip to Yellowstone was in order, so the six of us piled into the Caprice one August and hit the road, the back jammed with piles of moldy gear and packaged food. At 12, I was the oldest, but still just a girl, and it all still seemed like pure adventure. Geysers and hot springs and Old Faithful and cherry blintzes with whipped cream at diners, Father even agreeing to the occasional Coke. The smell of sulfur, hard mineral layers of red and yellow. As we approached the park, we excitedly pointed out columns of steam rising above the forests like apparitions. A few miles in, we passed a sign along the road with an outline of a bison and caution underneath. "Did you see that?" Emily was always yelling way too loud. She flung her body around to keep her eyes on the passing sign, the sound of her bare thighs squeaking against the seat. "Your butt just touched me." Jason pushed away from Emily, who had luckily gotten the window seat that day. "Give me some room." I nudged Jason with my elbow, the two of us jammed in the middle. "Hey," Father said lowly, eyeing us from the rear view mirror. He was just then adjusting. His body filled the front. His shoulders and torso commanded the entire space between steering wheel and seat back. I was always impressed by how he never had to turn his thick neck, how he could control us with a single look. The way he worked his jaw muscles during times like that scared me. You never knew when he might let something go or decide instead to pull over and yank the offending disobeyers out for a shove or two, lickety-split. Settle down. The road was narrow. There were more cars than Father would have liked. Too many people, he kept muttering. The trees, dense almost up to the road, seemed to hold magical things I wanted to find. Suddenly, the forest opened up to an expansive green field, steam rising in the distance, and beyond that, a tiny ghost-like mountain range. The field was full of bison, grasses up their legs. Before any of us had a chance to say anything, even before Emily could let out a squeal, Father jerked the car off the road and onto the strip of gravel. There were others parked ahead, people standing by with cameras at their faces. Father cut the engine. "What are you doing?" Mother looked at him. The wrinkles around her eyes creased in worry, but he simply stepped out and jogged to the back. The five of us watched, heads turning, as he opened the back door and grabbed the camera. "Just a couple shots," he leaned in. "You wait here till I say so." He looked at us kids. We remained belted in the back seat, hot thighs sticking. "Stop touching." We were constantly poking each other. "Move over." It was 100 degrees at least, and I thought I could feel the heat of the top of the car oozing down into my scalp. "Roll down the window," I ordered Eric, who had won the other window seat for the morning. "Stop breathing on me," Jason said to Emily, who was a persistently loud mouth breather. I partially felt for Jason, partially was glad I wasn't in his spot. Father, meanwhile, was creeping along the side of the road, Canon SLS uncapped and in hand. A bison had moved away from the herd and was eating by the edge of the field far enough ahead so I could barely see the sharp points of its horns above the wild, thick-looking tangle of its dark hair. No fence, beautiful freedom for the creature. I thought bison rather peculiar animals, hunchbacked, bare-bottomed, and wide-shouldered, their shaggy heads hung low between their forelegs. How did they get around like that? Especially with such tiny eyes set into all that kinky hair. And yet they did. Like bears I had read in the book I had checked out about Yellowstone, they could be fast and ferocious, deadly. They were unpredictable, or so Mother had whispered out the window as Father quietly passed moments before. "Don't get so close, Jim." Her voice sounded like steam escaping a vent. "Will you relax, Linda?" Father's jaw worked. There was no reason for him to, but he walked slightly bent at his hairy knees and crouched over, his wide shoulders hunched up toward his neck, as if he thought he could arrive by the bison's side unnoticed and snap an award-winning shot. Father stopped and took a photo, moved forward, took another. When would he stop? After much sighing, Mother finally leaned out the window, her door locked. "Jim!" she whisper-shouted. Yet when Father kept going, she turned around and gave us a wide smile that probably only I was old enough to truly know was fake. "Isn't this amazing?" Father stopped, snapped another shot, click, and then did something we weren't expecting. He turned to wave us out. Eric and Emily popped the locks and we were gone. "No!" breathed Mother. As we tiptoed past, she rolled up the window. It was cooler outside, but not by much. The greatest difference was our freedom, being able to move about and not touch hot, sticky sibling skin over which we took great offense, as if any of us should be so forward as to have bodies to take up space. Faintly, I could hear the sounds of the bison ahead chewing and shuffling. Again, the pervading smell of sulfur and wilderness. In the forest persisted branch after overlapping branch, thick and tangled, slim, light green grasses and tiny plants in the forest floor, dead leaves, heaving roots, wide streamers of late afternoon light, pockets of cool-looking shadows, the miniature sounds of hidden animals. We followed behind Father in a group, suddenly wanting to be close again, though Eric, the hyper one, the one who always got the most of Father's shoves, kept bounding forward on his toes, trying to get even with Father, who kept him back with his elbow. No, you stay there. We were close enough now to see how truly big the bison was, how its horns made almost perfect right angles, points shooting up to the sky. Soon we could see how it worked its hairy mouth over the grasses, how the hair on its chin quivered. Surely we would stop any moment. Father would stop and we would hide behind him, snatching peeks of the first bison we had ever seen, the first wild animal ever, really. I didn't know it then, but today I understand that safety, that love has contours. Danger lacks geometry. It couldn't care less about its non-shape. It is the space moving between both sides of a great open double doorway. It's the open mouth of a balloon, all the air wheezing out. Danger doesn't give a damn. Father didn't stop, and before we knew it, we were there. The bison was pulling great chunks of long grasses into its mouth. For a moment, I couldn't look away. I was enchanted by its size and color and honest smell, the steady, mellow crunching of its eating, by its confetti of hair, its hooves seeming to hold the earth in place, commanding the very planet. There was a certain comfort in seeing it, if only because it gave me the desire to somehow work to get it on my side. Finally, when I looked up, I noticed the people up ahead, cameras down, looking at us. I saw a man quickly waving, his mouth open. 15 feet away, the bison raised its head, and for a few seconds, it was just us and the bison and the wilderness. Before I saw it move, I heard its hooves against the ground and a snuff. I heard Mother's distant screaming, "Jim, Jim, it's coming, Jim." When Father told us to run, we did. Oh, the thrill, as if I were at the crest of the world's largest roller coaster, and then utter panic. The car looked very far away, and in it Mother's hair frizzy around her head and her mouth stretched wide into an uncertain black oval. I noticed the tips of her fingers pushing away the dash. I ran, but when I turned to look, Father was reaching for Jason and then had Jason's wrist in his hand and was pulling him back. Father's face was ecstatic, his mouth in a huge smile and his eyes gleaming. When his orange cap flew off his head, he left it. His brown hair flew back around the back of his neck, revealing the true length of his fuzzy sideburns. But Jason, he looked like he was going to die. And the bison was moving, its hooves in midair, its chest expanding. Why us? Oh, why? Why would this be the day? And then Father had his palm on Eric's little shoulder and was reaching for my arm and then had it. And for a moment, I stopped moving, was desperate to move. And then I was taking a step backward as Father rushed past me to tag Emily on the crown of her blonde head. Soon, the four of us kids were running together, forearms and wrists and shoulders rubbing, the sounds of gravel all around, and our frantic, forced breathing, and Father was starting the car, and Mother's screams were piercing, and then we were all on top of each other in the back seat, breathing, gushing air, and needing more, as if there weren't enough for all of us, as if someone would have to do without. My lungs were burning. The hot, heavy bodies of my siblings were around and on top of me, which in that moment felt like pure, shocking love. Father was gunning the car back onto the road, and we were sliding across each other, trying to push ourselves up to sitting. "Woo-wee!" Father shouted out his open window. But the rest of us were, for the first time, quiet. We had found our seats. My heart was still pounding. I felt sweat in my armpits and across my face, growing cold. Eric had turned and was facing out the window away from the bison and the field, but I could feel his chest rise and fall with the tip of my elbow. Jason was up against my other arm. I felt him trembling, so I looked and saw tears sliding down his cheeks and snot running over his lip. He soundlessly licked the snot up, staring out the front window, his hands palming his thighs. Emily, being the youngest, was the only one crying out loud, but she wasn't noisy doing it. "Stop it." Father looked at her through the rearview mirror, skimming over the four of us. He laughed. "You're okay. They're okay, Mother." and Mother turned to give us a smile, which was one of relief this time, but it also looked a little sad. She reached back and patted Jason's bare knee. "You're okay," she said, and found a tissue for him in her purse. Father slowed the car. Mother didn't say a word, but we all took one last look. Even Eric, who turned from the other window, whose pale face was gleaming with sweat. And Jason, who had just wiped at his face and given me a nasty look, mouthing, "What?" The bison was running back to the field, leisurely it seemed to me, its body making an easy seesaw movement along the side of the road. I could see in the gravel where it had stopped, only feet from where our car had been parked. The gravel had been pushed away in swaths, revealing cuts of dark earth underneath. It occurred to me then that the bison hadn't meant anything, had just been teasing us. I hoped the bison would at least stop and give us a look. We had been brave and good after all. We were impressive kids, weren't we? I was the only one watching as we drove on in silence. I know that the bison didn't stop and turn. It simply walked into the deepening light of its perfect field.
What a wonderful story. The tension really rises. So now we're at our Q&A part. And so I guess my first question is, it seems that all of you have something to do with interstitial space, even though it's not named. Elisa talked about interstitial space, and then Summer sort of demonstrated the space in between space, the space of the car, and the space of the kids in between the in the buffalo, and Mari, the space between her and her mother, which was in that last story very small, but at the same time very large. So let's talk about how you came to those images of using space or placement of characters to create a scene. Whoever wants to start. How about if we start with Summer? Because it was a space between the kids, the father, the mother, and the bison.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's interesting that there are all these moments of space, whether it's like open space where there's nothing, or space as a way to show that there's something there. And I think part of that is like creating tension between characters, like Mari's two characters. But then also interstitial space it's what's not there. It's the space between space, right? So I kind of think, and in my story, I guess that would have been the danger, right? Danger doesn't have a form, it's just open. And I think it's compelling to think of space as being freedom, but also how lots of space can actually be kind of frightening, and playing with that tension between freedom and almost too much freedom. Like there's some fear in that.
Yeah, that sort of applies to Mari's story as well, with the mother, and because there's all that. Her mother is dead, and really she's free. And the whole time you were reading, I was wondering, well, what would happen if they stopped reading those letters? Like, how are they going to prove that they read these letters? Would they still get their inheritance? So there's the space of believing that they have to do X when it's really not true.
They had to prove it.
Yeah, and then Elisa's was the interstitial space. I happen to know that term because I work in a building and take stairs all the time, and between the floors it says interstitial space in the.
Yeah, it's like I think I've seen it in staircases too, like when you take a staircase down instead of the elevator. I think it's interesting. I'm glad you asked that question, Rosalia, because when Summer was reading about the kids in the back seat and their legs touching, and kind of that the space issue that kind of came up for me as a thought about, how I think how we're kind of always addressing like this concept of space, you know, like what is in it, what are we seeing, and what is our relationship to that, how far in time, how, you know, like space. For me, when I was writing about space, interstitial space, I was really thinking about, you know, what happens when people die and we don't, you know, we don't see them anymore, but we feel them, right? And so there's like a space that is occupied around us with this loss, and the feeling of them, like the what, who we've lost or what we've lost, being there almost uniformly, like they're everywhere. Whereas, you know, in life, maybe they're just in one place and they're tangible and they're touchable and they're things that we can understand. But when they die, they go somewhere, they're still there with us and they're almost like everywhere. So that was the kind of thing that I was trying to address when I was writing about interstitial space in my poetry.
Mari, do you want to address the space? I mean, her fingers were sort of in her mother's space.
Well, yeah, and I have two stories, but they both have to do with a mother-daughter relationship. And in the first one, it's the mother's there, she's still alive, but the daughter still, she asks everyone else but her mother. And her mother is the one who could tell her about her past and all the secrets that she's guarding, but somehow Gertine can't ask her. She can't get herself to talk with her mother about it. And then the second story, the mother is dead, but she's right there, and she's like mixing through the ash. There's something just so very personal and kind of intimate about that, even though there's no mind melding. She doesn't know what her mother's thinking. It's just very confrontational still. But so there's different.
But it's very concrete. It's very. I mean, she picks up a molar and thinking it's a pearl.
Yeah.
You know? Like, where would that pearl come from?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the very closeness.
Yeah, but there's the other space that occurs in all of your stories. In Elisa's, it's the space of, I mean, very beautiful space of the wildlife where the birds live and the, you know, the water and the fish. When we think of wilderness, we do think of space. And with Summers, it's sort of the same, that field that all the bison were in. Those are huge animals, but they were in this open field, which is a space. And in Mari, she's in the space of her house alone because her husband may be having an affair, or he's at the lodge or wherever. So there's the space of the house. So space seems to be very important in all of your stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the first story, the daughter is traveling to her childhood home where her mother lives.
I sometimes wonder if there's like a kind of a connection that women have with space too. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing to contemplate sometimes, like being a woman taking up space. What is the connection to the environment? And I do think there is something kind of rich there. Mm-hmm. With a lot of, it always challenges me to think of, it brings a lot of ideas to mind when I think of women in the natural environment, women in,
Summer, was that the whole story?
That was the whole story, yeah.
Oh, nice.
It's very powerful. Mm-hmm. But women create space, as in Elisa's character, I'm sorry, I don't remember her name, the lady who passed away. I mean, she created space for all of that wildlife and all that, the birds that she loved. And then her absence created an even bigger space because of her emotional response to when the space she created as sacred was violated. Mm-hmm.
And there's that cool line you have about her heart being a place for all these people.
Yeah,
Right.
still beating,
Yep.
and that is Summer, I liked what you were kind of talking about, how women kind of take up or occupy space differently or think about space, what we're allowed as space, where our space is, it's really yeah, it's kind of, I mean, I can, like, my wheels are kind of spinning right now just thinking about relationship to kind of the tangible, and then, like, the unseen space that influences.
And very prescient now in this time where we are facing the loss of our rights to being with forces trying to make women smaller than they are. And then in Mari's story, Mari sort of touches on the other kind of space that exists between mothers and daughters, or maybe wives and husbands, that emotional space that exists between people, whether it's close or far away. So there's that other space. I mean, obviously, her mother is dead, but she's still attached to her. And that's something I understand very well. After my mother and I had a contentious relationship, but after she passed, I took it harder than anybody else of my siblings. But there's the space that exists between people who are loved ones, whether it's a husband or nature, or I really felt sorry for the mother in your story, clutching the dashboard while her children were flirting with danger. And I was thinking, as a parent, I mean, I think I would like to murder my husband at that point for doing something like that with children. So there's that other emotional space, which I think is found in all stories, because all stories is about the tension between people. So.
Can I just say, Mari, I hope those siblings rebel. Please let them rebel.
Well, it was fun to write. It was fun to write. And I didn't know what they were going to do for the whole till that it ended. So yeah.
Well, yeah. I guess I'll have to get the book.
You'll have to find out.
So let's talk about imagery. Elisa, your story reminded me very much of, I forget her name, but the story, there's a book called The Refuge, and it's by Terry, whose last name I cannot remember.
Terry Tempest Williams.
Yes, that's correct. Terry Tempest Williams, where she was writing about a wildlife preserve, but actually she was also writing about her mother and her relationship. Her mother was dying of breast cancer. And your book really echoed that a lot. Had you read that before? Did that influence you in any way?
I did read that book, and I remember very clearly being, like, on a plane and reading that part where her mother dies. And I remember just crying on this plane. I was just so connected to this story, it was so powerful. But she certainly has been, like, somebody that I deeply respect and admire as an environmental activist, and also a woman writing about the environment and taking on major issues in kind of the patriarchal system of exploitation of resources. I didn't think of her specifically when I was writing this story, but there's no doubt that those kinds of impacts that other writers have on you kind of culminate in your own story. Yeah.
And Mari and Summer, can you speak about the impacts of other writers on your work, even if you may not realize it until after you've read the work or after the work is written? Like, oh, that's sort of, I was inadvertently echoing this person, or maybe favorite writers that you have revered and it ends up being reflected in your work in somehow way.
I don't know that I've found that I'm echoing anyone, at least not that I'm conscious of. But I reading a lot, reading variety, reading wide is definitely worth doing, and something I would recommend. Your question made me think of the author Halldór Laxness, who's from Iceland, and just not that his stories are so in such a world that's so different from my world, that it's almost that it's interesting to try to think, how did he do that? How did he set up such a different world but make it feel like an everyday thing? How do you just have it roll off your back and the characters aren't responding, they're not reacting the way me as a reader is reacting? That just seemed pretty powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was same.
Yeah,
I mean,
Summer.
Yeah, I mean, as a teen, I just devoured anything Virginia Woolf wrote, and I think part of it was I loved how she was able to take everyday occurrences and make them just sparkle, just come to life, without not much of a plot, really. Of course, she's like the queen of the stream of consciousness, and really being able to get into the close third, get into people's heads. So I've always been interested in being able to do that, and how could I write like an anti-plot story, which really seems to me get to the heart of real life. Don't think I'm very good at it, but if anything, that's probably been the thing that's inspired me the most. But probably the other authors would agree with me here that when you write, you just write. I mean, you just don't know what's going to come out, and like Elisa said, there's probably influence in there, but I think so much of being a writer is trying to find your own voice. And I remember having a professor bring this up in a class once where she's like, yeah, I think some of you are finding your own voice, and that's really remarkable. So getting there is just kind of a neat process, but it probably takes a whole bunch of other influence to help you find who you are and that particular voice.
And to be a conduit for the story. My second book is so different from my first book. The voice is completely different, or the tone, it's just,
yeah,
was a challenge to switch, but so much fun to be in a whole different world.
Yeah. That's the
So
nice thing
how
about
do each of you approach writing? Do you write every day? Do you keep journals? Or how do you do you work? Some people I know are part of the 5 o'clock club. They get up at 5 and write for an hour before they go off to work. I've tried that and failed at it miserably because I just am not. I finally realized that I'm not that early of a morning person. So how do you approach the craft and the exercise and the discipline of writing?
I would like to say I have the routine and ritual. I strive to do that, but I tend to write when the story is ready to be put on the next part, when it's it just tends to occupy my brain, and I'm moved to write when I'm ready to add to that. It's not the best way to do it. I think people should try to show up every day. It usually ends up being every day, but
yeah, so it ends up being every day, whether
but not at a certain time, and not sometimes I find as I'm falling asleep, if I'm really thinking in the story, that I have to just get up and write some things down, or I'll wake up somehow with a line in my head. Not always. I don't usually am that engrossed, unfortunately. But yeah, I not got rules.
Anyone else?
I mean, I just kind of write constantly, wherever I am. I feel like I'll sit down and watch a movie, and I'll just kind of get bored, and then I'll just start like texting myself ideas. It's just kind of constant. And I have like multiple projects going on, but I do feel like I do have some discipline when I realize that there's like a story or something that I really need to tell. I need to write this. I feel like I can't stop thinking about it. And so then I will find the discipline and then like make myself complete it. But I don't know about anybody else. I have like a hard time finishing things. But lots of constant writing.
And Summer?
Yeah, and for me, I think it comes in waves. And I don't give myself, I personally feel like there should be the desire. And if I don't have the desire to write, I don't. And if I do, I do. Though, I probably wouldn't write if I didn't have, sometimes the desire's not there. And I just don't write for a while, for a long time. Maybe I'm more into reading or just storing things away. I feel like I have like a 10-year gestation period is brewing inside, and then, but yeah, like Elisa said, once I have the novel or the story idea, then it comes, and then, yeah, writing pretty regularly, but out of a desire to do it and not really a routine.
Mm-hmm.
Probably not the best, but whatever.
It works for you. So the very final question is, what we have some inspiring writers who watch us. What small piece of advice do you want each of you to give an aspiring writer? And let's go in alphabetical order. Elise, Mari, and then Summer. What do you want those people who want to be in your place with a published book? What do you want them to know about the writing life?
I would just say, I think everybody has a story in them, and I think everybody has something to say about their life and their experience. And so I just encourage people to find that in them, and to not compare yourself or your story or your work to anybody else, because you are super unique in what you've been through, and only you can kind of tell that. Yeah, that's probably it.
And Mari?
Well, I think that's great advice, Elisa. I think I would add, once you do sit down and put some words onto a page, think about the place. I kind of want to go back to what we talked about at the beginning of place and space, and sit in a scene and look around at what you see in the scene and how it feels and what you hear and what, all that, what you smell, and try to be in the place. And that will often come across on the page if you actually take a minute to, instead of just controlling and moving the pieces, to sit and have it talk to you.
That's great advice.
Well, this is also good. And on that note, yeah, I think if you find that you're writing and you totally lose yourself and you're in the place that you're writing, then you've succeeded. So if you are not in your room or in your study, and all of a sudden you're in your story, you're not thinking about what other people are thinking. You're not thinking about how readers are going to take it. You're not thinking, if you're writing like so-and-so, will you become famous? None of that matters. The book tours, none of it matters. It's how you are in this world you've created, and is it real to you? Do you see it in your head? And then I think that can bring the most joy and happiness, because most things won't see the light of day. Like, most of your work won't ever get published. And I think you have to realize that that's okay, and be okay with that the writing is so much more about getting published and having other people read it. Though, hey, it's great when they do, but I think it's more about cultivating your heart and soul and bringing some meaning to your life.
Mm-hmm.
What wonderful advice. I hope our aspiring writers take it to heart. And we're at time, so I want to say goodnight to everyone. Thanks, everyone who watched us this evening. I hope you weren't as inspired as we are, as I am. I hope you will join us in 2 weeks, which brings us to already, believe it or not, November 27th. So I hope you will join us for our next stream readings at that time. And good night, everyone, and thank you for tuning in.
Thank you,
Good night.
Rosalia.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.